Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 12th episode of the Gabriel Al-Salem Foundation's Consulting Without Borders Perspectives, our live monthly show in which we talk to international consultants and experts who work to address global challenges, promote professional excellence, and build a sustainable future for all. Welcome to everybody who is joining us today live. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to tune in. Welcome also to those who will be watching a replay of this broadcast. The replays are available on all of the social media of the foundation as well as on the foundation's website. I am Victoria Olskaya. I am the president of Gabriel Al-Salem Foundation, which is a U.S. nonprofit organization working internationally. Our work is dedicated to the remarkable life of and inspiring work of late Gabriel Al-Salem, who was himself an international consultant. He was a CMC, a certified management consultant, and he was a truly global citizen. Today is April 1st, and I'm broadcasting today from Florida. Please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, which part of the world. I hope everybody's doing great wherever you are on the globe. I will be able to see your comments and post them here. Today, we are broadcasting live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. You can ask questions directly in the comments of the platform that you are tuning in from, and we'll see your questions and we'll answer them here. Whichever platform you are tuning in from, please hit the like button. This way, more people will see us and be able to join our live stream. And in the end, if you don't really like our broadcast, you can always unlike us in the end. Today, the topic of our conversation will be Ukraine. This is not the first time that we'll be talking about this country, which is enduring hardship and fighting bravely in the war against Russia, against the Russian invasion. This is already our third episode in which we've been covering the situation in Ukraine, specifically focusing on the role of consultants and businesses in supporting the victory and also preparing for a recovery. This is our third episode, and our guest today, he actually spent many years in Ukraine. And the first year after the war, he was there. He was working, managing small-scale, managing funds for small-scale renovation and reconstruction projects. Our guest today, some of you who follow our broadcast already know him. He's been part of many of our episodes and participated in many of our conferences. He is one of the members of the board of directors of our foundation, a truly international consultant who worked internationally in over 50 countries in his 30 plus years of consulting work. And just like I said, he spent many years in Ukraine, specifically in this past year after the Russian invasion started in February 2022. So he has a lot to share with us. This will be a recap of his experience working there, and also he will be giving us his view of what lies ahead for Ukraine, this wonderful country. I would like to welcome Stephen Tupper. Welcome, Stephen. Welcome. Slava Ukraini.
Geroyam Slava. Well, good afternoon and great to see you all on April Fool's Day. Please do not adjust your computer. It really is happening that there is a session on Ukraine on this holiday. And because of her sense of humor, Victoria is wearing a cast on her arm, and I don't know whether this is a joke or genuine for April Fool's, but I suspect as a serious person, it's probably something serious. So
yeah, it's not a joke, Stephen. I wish it was. I wouldn't probably place such a prank on our show, even on April 1st, the All Fools Day. No, I actually had a minor surgery on my hand. It's not too bad, but I have to wear this bandage now, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to manage the broadcast, especially because my usual assistant, Gabriel Al-Salem, who is always on the backstage helping to put out our banners and change the videos, she is not available today because she is attending a very important event at her university. So I have to handle the technical part myself too, with 1.5 hands. So I apologize if there are any delays and I appreciate your patience with me.
don't worry about it, my dear. Just make sure that you are fully fit and back to normal, ready for the next session on the 1st of May, which will also be a holiday, but of a different variety. Yes.
Yes, the way that we structured our monthly broadcasts, we decided to do it on the first day of each month. We initially started on February 1st, which is the birthday of Gabriel Al-Salem, who is the inspiration for our foundation and all our work and our events. And then when we decided to become more regular, then we were thinking, well, we'll just do it on the first day of each month to be consistent. Of course, it's always different a day of the week, which might be an advantage or maybe not, but I thought that it's easy to remember. First day of each month, we're here live, and the time stays the same regardless of any changes to summertime or back. We just stick to 13 hours of the Greenwich Mean Time, the universal time, and then everybody can then adjust their local time accordingly. So yeah, thank you very much, Stephen, again for doing this broadcast. Again, Stephen is our regular participant, and in fact, Stephen already spoke exactly a year ago. We were addressing a little bit of a different subject. He was focusing more on his international development work because he is a truly international development consultant working globally because he's worked in over 50 countries. One of them is Ukraine. And today, 1 year later, just like I said, Stephen has some updates for us and will share his experience working in Ukraine, managing funds for small and scale renovation projects and a lot of humanitarian aid, because I know you were involved with helping people who were trying to find homes outside of Ukraine and did a lot of work for them.
Okay. Well, I think the best thing to do is if I first of all tell you a little bit about what I've been doing over the last year, for the simple reason that that will provide the setting or the background as to what I'm going to talk about. It'll only take a few minutes. And then there are 3 things I want to cover today, if at all possible. I want to cover what the future developments in Ukraine on reconstruction, renovation, and rebuild mean for consultants who are interested in helping Ukraine, and that be helping either on a commercial or a voluntary basis. Then I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the long-term issues that will need to be addressed by Ukraine. I think after the end of the war, but some of the features that are observable now are happening during wartime. And lastly, I want to say no more than 2 minutes on the biggest political event for Ukraine other than the war of in 2022, which was the decision that Ukraine will become a candidate for membership of the European Union, because this has big implications for the system of governance, the way in which a country is managed in terms of strategic planning, finance, and a host of other things, as it becomes clearly more accepted as a member of the European community. So a year ago, I was working for a large project managed by GIZ and funded by the EU and member states called ULEAD. And when the war started, I made the decision to stay on in Ukraine rather than evacuate, because in my view, it was easier for me to manage the processes that I was interested in helping from inside the country rather than trying to do it remotely. And so that's the reason why I stayed until the end of February this year. And in addition to doing the consultancy work for GIZ, I decided also to set up a fund for small-scale projects, reconstruction projects. They are tiny projects, which in some cases were co-financing activities undertaken by Ukrainian partners who might be missing an essential piece of equipment or a small amount of money in order to receive a large grant. And that is what I have been doing for the last year. And in fact, what I continue to do now even that I'm taking a break outside. So that is the background to what I was doing. And in doing this, I learned a lot of useful things, which I hope will be also useful for you. The response in Ukraine to the needs which have arisen as a result of the war have seen a complete explosion in the number of voluntary community NGO organizations who are key partners for the reconstruction of Ukraine and who are key partners if you're interested in being a consultant working with Ukraine. Many of these are new organizations. They, of course, are inexperienced, and they benefit very much from the support that they get online or offline from international partners who have experience working in previous conflict situations or who know how best to run projects, because obviously NGOs may not have much project management experience. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is that it takes time to mobilize. I noticed, for example, in humanitarian activities that they mobilized fairly quickly, but there was still a month or 6 weeks when there was a gap before the big players came on the scene. I think possibly because nobody really, the general consensus was that the Russians wouldn't be crazy enough to invade Ukraine. Unfortunately, this opinion was wrong, and that put people on the wrong footing, so to speak. So the NGOs have filled the gap, and volunteers and from all over the world joined in filling that gap until the larger institutions began to participate. This is an important factor to notice, because if you are interested in working with Ukraine, the situation now in early 2023 is that all of the large aid and donor organizations are now mobilized and are active in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something that you can do if you wish to work with Ukraine. And I will talk about how to do it in a few minutes. So it's just that you have to, the big empty patches that existed last March, April have gone. You now are talking about niches for particular activities, which I will go through with you. Of course, the lead time for mobilization of more expensive things like military equipment, etc., was rather longer. But even that, of course, it seems that it took forever. But for people like me who studied history, and particularly military history in the past, the amount of time that has been taken to provide equipment to Ukraine is roughly the same amount of time that it took the United States to provide stuff under Lend-Lease to Britain in 1940, 1941. These things take time, all right? But we are not consultants in military mobilization or the provision of Leopard or Challenger tanks. I just point this out that lead times are important and they shape the areas of intervention into which you can be involved. If you are interested in working with Ukraine, I would suggest that there are certain trends that you need to be aware of. The first thing is the war is still ongoing. I know that seems a silly comment to make, but you would be surprised how many people are talking about reconstruction without thinking about the fact that it's too early to reconstruct. The front line is moving all the time. Reconstruction has taken place very quickly in northern Ukraine, in Irpin, Bucha, Hostomel, which is where I was living. But of course, there's no guarantee that those areas are free from threat, from future military action. So a lot of the reconstruction activity or reconstruction desires are reflected at this stage and have to be reflected in planning for the future rather than building the future now. All right. Under Ukrainian law, all regions, oblasts, and local communities called Hromada, they have to have strategic development plans and activity plans. And before the war started, they all had or were trying to develop plans for the period 2021 to 2027, of which the first half of this 7-year period was 2021, 2024. And you understand that none of those plans, or hardly any of those plans now, are of immediate relevance or are 100% value, given that a war started in 2022. So one of the key needs for local governments and other organizations engaged in the provision of services to the population is in planning what they will do in the future when the war is over. But it has to be rather general at the moment. This is the work which many of the big donors are concentrating on, but there are plenty of regions and local authorities who are looking for advice on how to develop their strategic plans and are looking for partners to help them to identify how best to deal with the problems that they expect to face in the future. You can imagine this is extremely difficult because it's extremely difficult measuring the scale or the intensity of the future needs at this particular stage. But work has started and it needs to continue. If the Marshall Plan basically appeared at the end of World War II as the development plan for Europe, in Britain, the process of planning for the post-war started in 1941, 1942. And that is my preferred model for Ukraine, is to think about after the war, during the war, and then tighten things up towards the end. But there are not enough people with this sort of planning skill in Ukraine. Secondly, if you want to work with Ukraine, it is essential to find the right partners. If you are going to go on your own rather than working for one of the large donor projects, it's essential to do research on who is working at regional level. This is not difficult because nearly all of the partners who are engaged in activities at regional and local level in Ukraine are on the internet. They're on Facebook, and that is in fact where I track them very often to see who is doing what in Zhytomyr or Lutsk or Lviv, because they are using social media as a way of communicating with each other, raising funds together, undertaking projects together, or even producing goods for the local population or the army together. So a lot of research is involved, and many of the potential partners are going to be quite small. But being small They are fast and maneuverable and usually produce results pretty quickly. I mean, I give you one example. Yes, there's an NGO I work with in Zhytomyr, and it had a request to produce thermal underwear for the army, and it was done within a month. I suspect if we had done it through an international donor, we would still be designing the thermal underwear in summer of this particular year when it's no longer needed. Yes, so they are fast. So look for these people. Also, requests or offers of help to regional and local government direct will very often be welcome, because regional governments have also to control or manage or steer the reconstruction process, but they are chronically understaffed, both in absolute numbers of people who are available to do the work, but also in the skills, because they are literally underpersoned or undermanned. I don't know what you call it these days. So look for niches at local level and you will find them.
Stephen, I'm sorry. Yeah, when you talk about working with Ukraine and finding the niches and contacting the organizations there or companies, would this be also relevant to international consultants? Right? It wouldn't be just for the local consultants.
It's a very good question. There is a process of localization taking place in Ukraine amongst the larger donors, which I quite understand, because it is easier, obviously, for locals to work with locals. But I'm an international, and maybe because of my language skills, it is easier for me. But other internationals I know are working directly with local governments whom they have contacted or they have found out through the grapevine, or what is called in Russian sarafanное radio. So it's both internationals and nationals, because when we are talking about areas such as the use of international best practice, the international is needed for that rather than the national. The ideal work in any project at the moment in Ukraine is one where you are twinned, where you have somebody local you can work with, and you provide the international oversight, and they tell you how it could be done in reality, bearing in mind local practice and regulations.
Yes, okay. And as you said earlier, the big issue and the big problem is that nobody really knows how to plan ahead yet. There is not much of that expertise. So I would imagine that international consultants can be helpful in this particular area.
Absolutely.
Especially those who probably worked in similar territories or countries that were undergoing the war and then had to recover. Would that be the case?
Absolutely. That's also the case. But there is actually a niche which is obviously available for international and national consultants at the moment. There are a growing number of large-scale projects or facilities that are being created by the donors, like the Partnership Fund for Reconstruction of Ukraine, which is part British, but with lots of other donors. There's the Hoverlord project of the United States of USAID. There is ULEAD, which is coming from the EU, of course. And therefore, there are a large number of cases where local partners have potential access to grants to fund the projects that they want to undertake. Now, I am working in this area at the moment with NGOs in Ukraine in social services. And my contribution is to help them to design the application for the funding. They have the idea, they have identified the problem, they have identified the solution, but they don't know how to write a pretty logical framework, or how to use the right terminology, or how to construct a budget well. So if you find local organizations which are seeking a project based on a grant, you can make a major contribution to the success of their application for grant merely by providing your international experience, whether it is related to conflict zones or not, because these are general project management skills. They are the sort of skills that CMC and, in fact, the Gabriel Al-Salem Foundation is trying to support. And you can increase the chances of a partner being able to fund a good project, and you may actually be able to participate in the project management yourself on a semi-commercial basis. When I assist organizations to apply for grants to the big boys, they very often say to me, well, somebody is going to have to help us to run this project if we get the grant. Would you consider joining the board, or would you consider being an independent consultant working on this project? In which case my answer is, yes, I'd be delighted, or no, I can't do it, but I will find you somebody else who can. So you are generating business at the same time, if you're a consultant, as you're assisting the sponsor to raise the funding for their particular projects. And I think that is a major growth area for support to Ukraine in the future.
And when you talk about big boys, the big organizations, you're talking about big donor organizations such as...
I'm talking about big donor organizations. I'm also talking... Yeah, I'm also talking about the international financial institutions, although the picture is extremely volatile at the moment, as you can imagine, because really only since about October, November last year have a lot of these grant mechanisms come into existence, and they have basically had their first round of calls for grant applications in January or February of this year. We'll have the next one in May, June. And new players are appearing all the time, and priorities are also changing all the time. So you will find a donor who was interested last year in working with Ukraine on social enterprise will be more concerned this year in projects on social cohesion, where you have the problem of ensuring that people who are internally migrating to new areas are integrated into the local community. So that's another theme. So the variety of themes that is available or which is required for Ukraine is extremely broad at the moment. It's extremely broad. There is a huge need for training in project management. There is a huge need, partly covered by projects such as ULEAD, for strategic planning, etc., for the future. There is a huge need for technical skills, for example, in water, sanitation, rebuilding of housing, etc., all of which will be needed when rebuilding Ukraine city, or building cities for people who have moved within Ukraine and who have moved from east to west and will stay in the west, because after all, people are relocating internally. Okay, so a lot of research is required to do this, but it's not, okay, it seems daunting to start off with, but if you're a consultant who wants to work with Ukraine, find the first NGO or local government and then take it from there. You don't have to do a sort of massive, you don't need to write a PhD thesis to identify where the project opportunities are for you.
Are there specific resources, like online resources, perhaps databases of some organizations that are working in Ukraine, local, that would need this kind of work? Do you know of any?
There are organizations like the Association of Ukrainian Cities who can be a useful channel into larger population centers. It's also equally possible, of course, to find where the sources of financing are coming from, and then having seen that there's a grant for agriculture, to start doing your research from the funding end through to. But there are so many players. I find it difficult to track all the time what is happening. So I tend to concentrate on only one or two geographical areas, which for me are Kiev Oblast and Vinnytsia, which is where a lot of my reconstruction projects, little grant projects, take place. And sometimes Zhytomyr, no matter how good you are as a consultant, you can't cover all of Ukraine. None of the big donors can cover all of Ukraine, because we are talking, a reconstruction bill which is going to be measured in the trillions, not even in the billions. But there are lots of small niches. The second thing I'd like to say is that I haven't worked in this area particularly. I was involved very heavily in helping people to evacuate from Ukraine to basically to Germany, France, and United Kingdom in the first instance. And there's also a possibility for consultants to assist Ukrainians who are overseas. And you can do this through the Facebook pages of the organizations who have provided sponsorship or housing for Ukrainians, because many of them now are looking at ways to increase their incomes. Yeah, because you cannot live on handouts forever. And there's a time limit in the UK, for example, when you have to start becoming independent. So there's a huge demand within the Ukrainian community, which is currently outside of Ukraine, for services in helping them develop little businesses, in helping them understand the educational systems, to improve their language skills, and to improve basically their employment opportunities. So you could work with, if you're interested, you might find on Facebook a hub, which will be an organization in a particular geographical area, which works with Ukrainian, and start working with them that way. So you start working with Ukrainians outside Ukraine, and then you might end up coming back into Ukraine as and when they return. So I offer that also as a suggestion for a way to work with Ukraine. One of the things I have observed in the last year is that very often people underestimate the degree of sophistication in Ukraine. And this is particularly seen in humanitarian aid, where there's a tendency to import goods and services for the benefit of Ukraine, not understanding that Ukraine is a developed country. And therefore, there are lots of things that you don't need to bring into Ukraine because you can buy them locally. My principle in my projects is to buy locally. And the reasons are very simple. No country can survive without an economy. So therefore, it is better to keep money moving within Ukraine. It is obviously faster to do a bank transfer than it is to put something on a lorry and drive it for a week and go through several customs clearance procedures. So if you want to work with Ukraine on anything that involves goods and supplies, research what is available locally first. When you speak to your local partner, they will tell you, for example, that we don't need you to bring aspirin from Norway, which was one case I had, because there's plenty available in a storage facility outside Kharkiv. So please also look at what is actually needed, because many people have assumptions about what Ukraine needs, but they don't always ask what is required. And things have to be demand-driven.
Yeah, this is a very great comment and observation. And for me, when I see how much is actually happening in Ukraine, regardless of the dire situation that the country is in, how much work, both in the production area and also consultants with whom I'm in touch, how much work they're doing. It's very impressive. It's amazing that the country is actually living the life that it's living, and the spirit is there, and nobody's giving up, and life goes on. So.
No, I mean, I have said this to the Ministry of Economy in Ukraine, that Ukraine is a country at war with a peacetime economy still functioning.
Yeah.
And we need to keep the peacetime sector still working. So there's a lot that the consultants can be doing to assist SMEs, to businesses, etc. For example, businesses relocate, businesses expand, NGOs actually engage in business. So a lot of business consultancy opportunities exist within Ukraine when you identify them. They may not be huge long-term opportunities, but very often what is needed is something small, short-term, which can be turned around very, very quickly, which can have some substantial knock-on impact. We all have to remember the multiplier of J.M. Keynes, that a small amount spent on one service may have a multiplying effect on other sectors. So it's useful to actually concentrate on small things which have are at a certain pressure point in the economy and let them just expand from there on. Now, I suppose this may seem a strange way of discussing Ukraine, to discuss the opportunities first. I'm probably not being a very good management consultant in doing it this way, because I think it's necessary also to discuss what the problems are, because if you don't know what the problems are in the long term, it will be difficult to identify the needs or the marketing opportunities for consultants. I see the following problems for Ukraine in the long term. I don't mean in terms of the war, I mean in the entire reconstruction period and in the post-reconstruction period. The first problem that Ukraine has is a demographic problem. The Ukrainian population was falling substantially before the war, and of course it has been catastrophically impacted by the mass evacuation that took place early in 2022, where basically 25 to 30% of the population is now located somewhere else. And when I say somewhere else, I mean outside their oblast of origin or even outside of Ukraine.
Right.
I don't know, I'm not used to quoting Marx on sessions with the Gabriel Al-Salem Foundation, but labor is the source of all wealth, yes? Right. And so therefore, the big problem for what Ukraine in the long run will be getting people to come back. And getting people to come back means that the key issues to be concentrated upon in the immediate term are water and electricity and sewage, so that there are healthy situations in which to live, housing, and work. So everything else is secondary to the first basic services in which we have to be involved. I have colleagues and friends who are consultants from Ukraine, and the concentration is upon provision of basic services, then housing. Education and everything else is important, but it comes slightly later. We have to create the conditions for people to return to Ukraine. Now, the reason I say this is a problem is I look at the Ukrainians whom I have assisted to move abroad, and that the longer they are abroad, the harder it will be for them to come back, and the less likely that it will be that they come back. For example, if you have children who are teenagers who have an opportunity to move into tertiary education, etc., you don't want to take them back to Ukraine if they can go to university in Scotland. Yes?
Right.
But the Ukraine's long-term survival is based on the fact that people will need to return, and the conditions need to be created that encourage people to return. It will be a slow process, but Ukraine cannot afford a huge human and brain drain in the long run if it's to function as a country or even to survive. Membership of the European Union and the adoption of European standards in education, etc., will be probably a stimulant to people to go back, but persuading people to go home at the moment is extremely difficult, even to those areas which aren't immediately the subject of military action. Okay, So the demographic problem worries me very much. It worried me before the war. It worries me even more now.
What do you think could be other incentives for people to come back, perhaps not right away, but even after some time, in addition, of course, to Ukraine, hopefully being added to the European Union? Is there anything else that the government can do or international organizations can do?
Well, it's unfortunately I don't run an international organization, but if I did have one, which would be just wonderful, I would, for example, greatly increase the. Well, first of all, I would create financing mechanisms which would allow people to rebuild their own homes rather than waiting for the government to do it. Yeah, that's one thing. And the reason I say that is that we all think of former Soviet countries as dominated by large multi-story blocks of apartments, but in fact, many places in Ukraine, people are living in small private housing, and what they need is some sort of 0% loan or a grant to rebuild their small house. So I would do that. I would also be seriously working on the availability of business development grants so that people can set up their own businesses or reopen their farm to come back because they need a livelihood.
Right.
Yeah, they need a livelihood. So it means basically thinking creatively about financial instruments to encourage people to rebuild and to build business. And that would be a big incentive. Because if I'm given a choice between claiming unemployment benefit in London or having a going concern in Ukraine, I myself will move back to Ukraine.
Okay. And the weather is better anyway in Ukraine compared to Great Britain, to London.
Yeah, and the cost of living is a damn sight more.
And the cost of living, yes, that's true.
The cost of living. No, I mean, I don't want to be unpatriotic, but you know very well I prefer to live in Ukraine than in Great Britain, even if I'm a British citizen. The second problem I see long term is one of health and mental health. Now, one of the NGOs with which I work particularly is in Vinnytsia, and it's a childcare centre. And I also have some contacts with rehabilitation centres for the disabled, for children who have cerebral palsy, etc. And there's going to be a big problem for Ukraine in the long run in that the incidence of health problems has increased dramatically. The worst example that I have seen is that in areas affected by the military activities, the incidence of premature birth has gone up it's doubled. Mm. And so children are suffering from birth-related defects, hydrocephaly, and other causes, and they are going to require extensive medical care for the rest of their lives, which they would not have had if they had not, if their mothers hadn't been put through the stress which led to premature births. Another example is when we look at the Children's Centre. The Children's Centre was originally created to deal with speech problems, but in fact, more and more children are requiring multiple forms of treatment for behavioural issues, for Downs, for ADHD, they will have multiple symptoms and multiple courses of treatments are required, so that the problems of health are becoming more intensive as well as more common. And this is going to be a huge burden on the health service in the future. And as I say, this is going to be forever. This is not something which will end with the war. So the adoption, for example, of new forms of healthcare using perhaps EU or even US international practice will be essential for dealing with health problems. Another problem is education. Yeah. Everybody has had, most children have had interruptions to education caused by the war. Unfortunately, they had 2 years of COVID when schools were closed first, now followed by over a year of war. This means that many children have delayed or interrupted education, and their educational standards will be lower. I say this even though I have the greatest respect for parents who are having to do homeschooling because of the closure of schools, but these more investment is going to be required in education or in the introduction of new teaching methodologies so that kids catch up, because this is again going to be a lifetime problem, because they will then go on to university with lower grades. Universities have also been interrupted by COVID and the war, so the educational system is a key problem for the future. And without the educational system functioning properly, of course, that means that people are entering the employment or job market with fewer skills than competitors they will have overseas. And Ukraine has to compete on an international market in terms of the international economy. So those are the key problems I see at the moment. I would also add that there are mental health issues that have to be dealt with because people have been subject to trauma and stress. I don't know. This is not my field of activity. I try to understand what can be done about this, but this is extremely difficult because it's almost impossible to measure other than on a case-by-case basis with individual people who have been forced to flee their homes. I mean, I'm talking about people whom I have met who have lost everything. And in some cases, I have people I helped to move who have lost everything twice, because they lost it first in 2014. And then having moved to Mariupol, they lost it again in 2022. So the mental health issues, where you have families with kids, you have families with the elderly. Let's not forget the elderly, who have the stress of being uprooted and who require social support mechanisms to somehow get back. I mean, I don't want to sound too depressed, but the volume of work that's involved in this area is enormous, much greater than the amount of work which is required in developed economies which haven't gone through this process.
Yeah, this is hard to comprehend, to wrap your head around how much people had to suffer and still suffering as a result of this invasion. Just like
absolutely.
you said, mentally, not even, although this is terrible, already losing their homes, moving, but just to experiencing the trauma of going through this, not just once.
Yeah. There's the trauma which doctors are looking at the moment, which is people who don't have an uninterrupted night's sleep for a year because there's an air raid, even if there's not an attack. That you have an air raid 2 or 3 times at the beginning of the war during the night, you're not sleeping, and you cannot go without sleep for a long time. We all know that sleep deprivation was a favorite tool for Stalinist interrogations in the 1930s, and basically you have the same sort of problem now. I'm looking at the very good question on...
Yes, we have a question from actually David Norman. He already said hi earlier in the broadcast. He's in North Carolina, and we actually talked about our episode. I was very happy to reconnect with him. And thank you, David, and welcome to our broadcast. Thank you for tuning in and for asking your question.
No, I mean, I like the idea of the ethics contract. It is not happening yet, but it needs to happen. The ethics contract I would see as an understanding or an acceptance of a common agenda between the participants in the reconstruction process, where people do not restrict their activities, or particularly the activities of others, according to traditional demarcation lines between institutions. So far more informal cooperation or more openness is needed between government and the general public. This is something which is possible in Ukraine, partly because it has such quite a highly developed civil society, and also because since 2016 there's been a very extensive process of decentralization. So a lot can be done at the bottom, but there is a need to ensure that the government at the top also remains open to new ideas that are coming from the informal sector, from the NGO CSO sector, or from local community groups. The successful projects that I have seen involve a common agreement between participants and the consultants who are advising them on how to reach objectives. This is important because one of the biggest obstacles to the EU accession process at the moment is the issue of corruption. And only the ethics contract approach is going to ensure that incidences of corruption are reduced. I'd love them to disappear altogether, but I mean, I can't get them all to disappear even in the UK. Yeah, but I agree with you absolutely, David, that having an ethical approach is important, but also having a demand-driven approach, because too many of the policies I see are based on inadequate consultation with the end users of your policy. This is not a uniquely Ukrainian issue, of course. That was a very good question. You made me think a lot. I'm not used to doing it so often.
Yeah, Stephen. Yeah. Thank you, David, for the great question. And one of the topics that we decided that you will approach today is the key stages in European Union accession and the obstacles. And you already talked about this to some extent. So perhaps you could, recap on what you've already said. And
no, I mean, the situation at the moment, of course, is that Ukraine made an application to join the European Union, and last year it was basically accepted as a candidate for accession. Becoming a candidate for accession is just the start of a very long process whereby the key requirements of what is called the acquis communautaire have to be applied, where, for example, in the case of Ukraine, more European models which are applied to European regional planning and strategy will have to be used, where the standards for fighting corruption will have to be improved, etc. So there's a very, very long list of what Ukraine needs to do in order to become a member, and it's going to take some years to do this. How many years? That's an extremely difficult question. Some of my friends think it's going to take till 2030 to do it, but that is not an excessive number of years, given that the benefits of some benefits of membership accrue during the accession process, particularly in the source of funding linked to meeting the conditions of the communautaire might become a possibility. But it's an important political statement for Ukraine that the EU has accepted the candidacy status, along with, of course, Georgia, Moldova, and others, yes, who are interested in becoming EU members. But at the moment, we are at the stage where we have two documents which are important from a national level, from my viewpoint. One is the plan for reconstruction of Ukraine, which was produced at a conference last summer. And the other one is an assessment of Ukraine's performance in preparation for EU membership. Ukraine already has an association agreement with the European Union, which was, of course, the source of the political ruckus in 2014. So the EU measures the progress of Ukraine to meeting the conditions for membership on a regular basis, and the last assessment was also done last summer. But the amount of work that is involved in actually preparing Ukraine, and particularly its legislative system for EU membership, is enormous. I think it can be done. It will be done, because I consider already, I've always thought of Ukraine as a European country, which is what it is.
Do you think that the fact that Ukraine is now fighting in this war against Russia can help the accession to EU, or is it making it more difficult simply because so many other things have to be done? And just like you said, it's a huge work to prepare certain institutions and whole systems for EU accession.
I think Ukraine's successes in keeping going during the war provide the political impetus for the agreement of the EU to accept Ukraine as a candidate for accession. That is the key result, if you like, from the accession perspective. But I do not see that there is an automatic conflict or tension between the reconstruction process and EU accession process, because I think basically that the reconstruction process can be conducted using models of reconstruction that have been applied to other EU member states. For example, we have to remember that Croatia was very severely damaged during the collapse of Yugoslavia and conducted a reconstruction process and an accession process at the same time. Ukraine is much larger. The issues are more complex. And let's face it, the costs are also enormous compared to Croatia. But Croatia is a good example of how you can combine the two, and how, in fact, the accession process can be used as a way of underpinning reconstruction. So I don't think that there's a conflict in that.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for this great information and so much good advice for consultants who will perhaps or want to consider working for Ukraine and in Ukraine. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the award that we as a foundation.
Can I make one last sentence, my dear?
Of course.
If there's anybody who's out there who is interested in working with Ukraine from amongst our consultant audience, I would be happy to receive questions or requests for contacts, and I will try and find somebody you can work with.
This is great. Thank you so much. Let me post here our foundation's website, which has all the contact information. And if somebody wants to contact Stephen personally, you can just send an email to me or to the general email listed on the foundation's website, and we'll be happy to connect you to Stephen or anybody else on the foundation's board who can be of any help. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for everything you did in Ukraine and continue doing. And I just wanted to talk a little bit before we wrap up about the award that our foundation has been running since 2011 for already many years. It's called the International Award for Excellence in Consulting. And we had quite a few winners in all these years. And I'm happy to say that we stay in touch. There's almost like a community of winners from our award. And I'm always happy to see how consultants are growing and developing and expanding their opportunities and countries where they're working. Well, last year, because of what is happening in Ukraine, we decided to establish a special award, which we simply called Award for Ukraine. And all the information is available on the foundation's website. This award is for Ukrainian organizations and companies which make positive contribution to Ukraine's economy and victory. And we will be very happy to receive the applications. These companies and organizations can be nominated by consultants and other professionals who are working in Ukraine or with Ukraine. There is a very simple application form on our website that needs to be completed. It's just a one-page form which asks the consultant or the person who is nominating this company or organization provide some basic information which we can then verify. And the deadline to submit applications for actually both awards, the International Award for Excellence in Consulting and the Award for Ukraine, is October 1st. There's still plenty of time. We're accepting applications on a rolling basis. Our award international committee will be reviewing the applications after the 1st of October, and we'll be making announcements by mid-December with the idea of publicly announcing the winners during our annual event on February 1st. Whether it will be a virtual event or perhaps we can already meet in person somewhere, but this is our plan. So please stay tuned, look for the information on our website, send your applications in, and our award committee, which does include Stephen, by the way, of course, will be very happy to review your work, and I'm sure there will be a lot of deserving winners for these awards. Thank you very much, Stephen. Let me see if we have any more comments here before we start wrapping up. David is saying, yeah, he's okay. He just wanted to thank you for your comments on his question about ethics in consulting. So I guess we are ready to wrap up, and I would like to thank everybody who joined us live today, and also thank everybody who will be watching this replay, because just like I said, all our episodes are available on the Foundation's social media platforms and also saved on our website. So I understand today is a Saturday, it's April 1st, and perhaps some people might have thought that we're not actually doing anything on April 1st, and all this was just a joke, but it is not. we are doing the broadcast, and we are here live. But I understand that people might have been busy to join, especially in those parts of the world where it's already evening time and perhaps almost nighttime. But anyway, thank you to everybody. Thank you to Stephen, our inspiring speaker. Please tune in again exactly in 1 month on May 1st. Our next speaker and the topic will be announced a little bit later. You can just follow the information on the social media and the website. Thank you for staying with us. See you in 1 month, and goodbye for now. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.